Good afternoon, students and faculty members who are present here. I'm sure you're going to love this talk. I have been a big fan of Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, and it gives me immense pleasure, and I'm honored to sort of thank Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay to be here and give this talk, as you are seeing on this, on the projector on the Indian city. So let me take this opportunity to ask our director, Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani, to sort of officially welcome Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay. So may I request Antara? It's a small token of our appreciation, sir. We really treasure this. Thank you so much. Well, I sort of kept this a secret, although I have met him almost a couple of hours ago, that I first met him. I don't think he remembers, in 2008 at a conference in IIM Bangalore on the Public Policy Management Conference, and I was presenting a paper with my professor from IIM Ahmedabad, and he was chairing that session on public-private partnerships. And from that moment, I sort of became a big fan of his writings, and the biggest example of which was that in 2010, roundabout 2010, IDFC published its India Infrastructure Report on a low-carbon society, and Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay wrote the foreword for it, and I never ended up reading beyond the foreword because it was able to capture each and everything about low-carbon societies. Thank you so much, sir, for being such a big source of inspiration to all of us. Sets certain benchmarks and certain guidelines for us to work on. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to, before I officially sort of invite Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay to commence his talk, also shed some light on what Symbiosis School of Economics, a young institute, has been doing in the domain of urbanization or challenges related to urbanization. So we are very young, but we have set goals for ourselves, and we are slowly but steadily moving towards those goals. We have been committed to sort of doing a sustained, committed to doing some kind of sustained actions related to research on urban issues and challenges, and it was initiated right from the time when Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani assumed charge of this institute, when we did a big national conference on issues related to urbanization. And it has been a conscious effort on our part at Symbiosis School of Economics to include a lot of workshop mode interactions on urbanization and urban related issues and challenges around those. Last year we reached a new high, and we sort of engaged in a research-oriented dialogue with academicians around the country, and we organized a national level workshop where we sort of brainstormed on what should we research on urban areas, and we were puzzled to a great extent, but we had some direction. We are still grappling with those frameworks. We are engaging in a dialogue with academicians, practitioners, and other researchers, and I'm sure the momentum will not fade. So before I take much of your time, I have this job of mine to introduce him formally, because I'm sure many of you might not have gone through his profile, which I had sent via email. That's an important thing, because that will sort of summarize the stature of this personality. Professor Partha has been now a senior research fellow at the Center of Policy Research, New Delhi, since 2006, and his last assignment was with Infrastructure Development Finance Company, where he was involved in nurturing policy and regulatory frameworks for the flow of private capital into infrastructure projects. Prior to this, he was with the Export-Import Bank of India as the first director of their Eximius Learning Centre in Bangalore, and before that with the World Bank in the Trade Policy Division in Washington. He is currently a member of the Expert Committee on ICT for Indian Railways, Government of India, and of the Working Group on Roads, National Transport Development Policy Committee, and of the International Advisory Board of Laning Asia, Colombo. Recently he has worked with the Committee on Allocation of Natural Resources and the Committee for Consultations on the Situation in Andhra Pradesh. He has taught at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, XLRI, Jamshedpur, and the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. His current research interests are in the development paths of India and China, urban development and infrastructure. He has a PhD in economics from New York University and an MA and MPhil from the Delhi School of Economics. Sir, with immense pleasure, and I would like to invite you to the podium.
Thank you, Amir. That was, as usual, over generous. I'm not going to live up to that billing, but what I will try and do is make your life, hopefully, a little more interesting over the next couple of, next hour and a half or so. So, first, thank you to Symbiosis for having me. Any place which says School of Economics always has a soft spot in my heart, because that's where one of the places I graduated from. So I'm really happy to be here at the Symbiosis School of Economics and among so many young friends. What I'll do in the course of today's talk is broadly go through three large chunks, right? I'll spend a little bit of time providing a context which will be somewhat stage setting, because for a number of you, you may not be quite so familiar with how we have come to where we are today. And then I'll move relatively quickly into the focus of my talk today, which is the Indian city. We'll first begin a little bit with what is a broader urban story in India, and then talk a little bit about the city itself, how you see it, what you think should be the rationale for Indian city, Sheher ka maqsad in some sense, and then hopefully we'll have lots of questions. But if in the interim you wish to have raise any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I will take clarificatory questions during my talk, and I will defer all substantive questions until the end of the talk. So if I'm not taking your question, that doesn't necessarily mean it won't get answered. It's just that you have to wait a little longer for it to be answered. But you may forgive me, because the floodlights might just prevent me from actually seeing your hand. So if I miss you, my apologies. Right? So let me see if I can make this work. I'm usually pretty bad with this kind of stuff. So let me first try and see whether, yes, it can go back. Wonderful. So let's begin with the context. So what has actually changed? So currently in the newspapers we hear a lot about how India is slowing down, you're growing at 5%. There's a lot of hullabaloo about it, right? So, but what was actually India's story? And this gives you a picture from 1950s onwards, and focus essentially on the dark black line. I think one of these things, yes, that's right. So focus on this dark black line here, which gives you broadly a period average of the growth rate over this period. So all the way up to 1980, which is well before almost all of you were born, you had a growth rate of less than 4%. It was used to be called the Hindu rate of growth. Then we bumped up a little bit and went roughly to where we are currently now, which is about slightly under 6%. And that continued for a very long time until almost the last decade, whereas when a lot of you started going to school. And that's when the big spurt in growth happened. So we got used to, you got used to a relatively high rate of growth as a normal phenomenon, because this part, in some sense, was outside your experience. And that is essentially one part of the story. So the first part that I would like to show that we are now a much faster growing country than we used to be usually for a very long period of time, right? So the first change that has happened. The second change that has happened is when, I don't know how many of you went through your civics books and how many of you are reading history, when India became independent, the focus was on what we call seizing the commanding heights of the Indian economy. So the public sector, the government was supposed to take charge of the big things in the Indian economy, which means the big steel plants, the big electricity production, the large petrochemical complexes, all the quote-unquote large big stuff was supposed to be done by the government, because, and quite possibly that was the case in that point in time, you had a situation where entrepreneurs, private entrepreneurs, were not thought to have the capacity to be able to execute these kinds of things. So at that point in time, the Birlas and the Tatas had this large iron mill, the Birlas had a very large textile business, but there was still not, you still didn't think that there was the depth of entrepreneurial capacity, partly because you suspected that the colonial rule, which the British ruled over us for about 100 years, and before that the East India Company ruled over us for around 100 years. So you had, that would have dampened entrepreneurial spirits. So the thrust therefore was the driver's seat was to be taken off by the public sector. And that's what you see when you move forward, is this rise in the share of the public sector from under 10% to almost a quarter over the period from 1960 to about 2000. But then, just like if you go back and you see this big spurt in the growth rate around this time, that's also when the share of the private sector begins to stabilize. Which means that in some sense the role of the public sector, the role of government, has reached a certain maturity at this point in time. So there's a second big change that's happened to India over the last 50 years or so. The third is, when we began, we were very afraid of the outside world. We always felt that we were not big enough or competent enough to be able to compete with people outside. So we tended to be insular. Right? So, I think I'll use one of these things. That's fine. Yeah. So if you look at it this way, you have, at that point in time, you had both our exports and imports together were actually under 20%. So whereas today, as you see this thing growing slowly, it's stabilized, more or less stays within these. Look at the top 10% and the bottom 10%. So then below this line is imports, above the line is exports. So this is what we are essentially exchanging with the world, and these numbers are as a share of our GDP. So if I'm saying, think of it as large for those of you who are not familiar with economic terminology, and Professor Chandramani tells me that we have you from a variety of disciplines and years in this room. So think of the size of these bars as largely how big the engagement is with the rest of the world. So, and as you can see, all the way up to the 1990s, it stays within this plus minus 10 bracket. It went down very sharply in the 1970s, and then it sort of stays within this area for all this time, first 40 years of our existence. And then it starts to grow, and now of course it's risen to almost 60%. In fact, if you read the newspapers, the big talk now is about this gap right here, which is the, what you call the current account deficit, which is the difference between what you are importing and what you are exporting. So now, just as an aside, to give you a sense of what imports and exports mean, let me also take short minutes to rephrase what Paul Krugman says, which is, what benefits you? You get worried about when your exports are not enough to pay for your imports, which is your current account deficit. But what is it that actually is benefiting? Is it exports or is it imports? That's a question. Yeah? How many people say exports? And how many people say imports? So the young man over there in the grey shirt that's behind the red check shirt, you said something about how do you think imports actually benefit you? Okay, and why do you think exports benefit you?
We are capable of affording new technology.
Come again?
We are capable of affording imports.
You are capable of affording imports. So fundamentally, what you actually use, what you actually consume, is imports. That's what gives you pleasure, that's what gives you benefits. It's just that whoever is exporting that, whoever is giving that thing to you, that person or country or whatever entity wishes to be paid. They don't want to give it to you for free. Just like when you want to buy a Coke, the shopkeeper won't give you Coke for free. He's expecting money to be paid to the guy, right? So exports are the necessity of having to pay for your imports. Exports by themselves are not particularly useful because you're sending goods out. How does that benefit you? If you're giving things away, how can that ever benefit you, right? It's only when you get something in return. Now the Chinese, for instance, are waiting for a long time. So they're exporting a lot and they keep getting money and they're stacking it up on their halls. And they'll keep stacking and stacking and stacking. So one fine day somebody might benefit. But for the moment, nobody's really consuming anything. Right? So if it's like you work and you work and you work and you never go out to see any movies and you never have, go out to restaurants and do nothing. But you have a huge bank balance. It makes you feel very good that someday you're going to throw a really big party. Someday you can go off to, you have a favorite holiday destination. But that's someday. Right? So to that extent, a deficit in that sense of a large current account is not something to be really worried about. Somebody is willing to pay for it. Just like some of your parents are paying for your education right now. If somebody would pay for your imports, life would be fine. Right now we are getting worried because nobody is willing to pay for it. So that's something we need to keep in mind, right? So, but it's useful to always think that the benefits countries get are much more from imports than for exports, because that's what actually you consume, that's what you invest, that's what you use. The other big change is a growing belief in the future. People like me. When we began 50 years ago, that was our savings rate, about 10%. Half of which, a little more than half of which used to be by households, the rest by companies and so on. Today our savings rate, which means, as I said, just like the Chinese are doing, stacking up money, not spending it, because we think we're going to get a lot more things to spend on in the future. That stuff is now up to 30%. That basically means a lot of people believe that the future is going to be much, much better than the present. Right? So that's the other big change that's coming into the system. So while all of that stuff is happening, what's happening to the people? So the people themselves, for the first 40 years of our existence, we had a situation where almost everybody stayed on the farm. Right? So we began with about 3/4 of people on the farm, and 40 years later, there are about 70% of the people still practicing economics. And something happens in the 1990s. You read about it, liberalization, I'm sure your professors will walk you through it, so I'm not going to spend too much time, you can talk about it in Q&A, that's when it stops dropping. And today, the number of people who are using agriculture as a primary occupation is less than half. Right? So that's when the large thing starts to drop. And what starts to grow? The green stuff. And what's the green stuff? So you're building the country. When in the real boom periods, when Korea starts to grow, when Japan starts to grow, that's when you see these kinds of numbers show up as a share of construction. Okay? So this essentially means a whole bunch of people around the world, around the country, are essentially building stuff. And if you think most of these guys are make-work guys running on the Mahatma Gandhi NREGS program, that's not it. That's a very small proportion of the story. This is not government-induced work. That's an important part of the story, and I'm happy to talk about what I think are the real benefits of DMG and NREGS. But that is a whole bunch of people around this country essentially building up a nation. And now, the other thing that's happened is, which shouldn't be a surprise to you, is we now have a lot more people with education. You had a situation, and this is even more so, and that's quite visible from this room, a lot more women with education, proportionately speaking. When we began in let's say, if you take this, essentially is what we call a cohort effect. So we take a group of people now, we then sort of simply look at the 60-year-olds and say what levels of education do they have, and then we look at the 15-year-olds and say what level of education do they have. And if you look at the 60-year-olds, if they're rural and they're female, if rural women who are more than 60 years old, there's less than 10% chance that they would have got even a primary school education. That number today is 77%. Right? So, as far as urban women and urban men are concerned, that number is above a 90%. So, as far as primary education is concerned, almost every Indian today is going to school and has been through primary education. Does that mean the person knows how to read and count? One hopes so. Maybe not. We can talk about that later. The second thing is, in higher secondary education, there's a big puzzle. This is something that we don't quite know what is happening. But something is happening. The puzzle is this. Can you tell me what the puzzle is over here? For those of you who can see the lower half of that particular slide. What is puzzling about that slide? Come again? Dropping of what? So there's a dropout from 90% to 40%, that's true. People do drop out of school. What else? Something wrong in this slide itself. To some extent related to that, but mostly in this slide. The rise is less. Yes, you see over here, it's the fact that you are catching up. The fact that you're catching up at 90%, that's very nice. The fact that you're catching up at 90% is not surprising, because it's possible that you'll start to slow down as you hit the maximum is after all 100, right? The problem here is that women have caught up, but they've caught up and actually have gone past. If you actually look at the numbers, they're going to show up very clearly with the men at this very low level of 40%. Urban men level of the percentage who have a higher secondary education has almost stagnated over the last few cohorts. They've gone up very slowly from about a third to about 40%. The women have been catching up very rapidly. If you take a look at the 40-year-olds, of 34 to 40, these guys have gone from 20 to 40. So fundamentally, there is something happening here, and we don't quite know exactly what, that men are not choosing to, enough men are not choosing to stay on and get a higher secondary education. So that's one of the issues that we need to think about going forward. And finally, to segue into the topic of our day, which is we are now a much more urban people. And I'll come to see as to whether we can believe these numbers or not is something that I'll be talking about going forward. Right? So we were up 1901, at the beginning of the last century, less than 10% urban. And now we are about 30% urban. That doesn't sound a lot, right? I mean, sort of growing up from 10 to 30 in over 110 years. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So far, any questions? Because I'm just going to move into a different topics as we move forward. Sure? Okay. So what does this number say? It says that 30% of our people are actually urban. How many of you know what does it mean to be urban? When I say 30% of people are urban, what do I mean? They all live in Pune? No. It's only 5 million of you from 1.2 million. So, how do you define urban in India? Come again? In terms of the population, okay? So, population and facility. Standard of living. So if you're poor, you can't be urban. No? So what do you mean? Okay? Yes?
So there's any criteria that simplifying your standard of living, like the calorie requirement or the wages or income that you earn. Based on that, you feel the classified as urban or
Interesting. It's not too far from what I just said. Yes,
non-agricultural occupation.
Come again?
Non-agricultural occupation.
Non-agricultural occupation. It's actually one of them. How much of it do you know?
75%.
75% of
Men. Of men.
75% of men need to be working in non-agricultural occupations. And that's one third of your answer. Yes?
Yeah, I'm a little scared to give this definition because I know you've critiqued it, right? The census definition of what urban.
I'm just telling you how we count it. How do you get 31.2? How do you get 31.2?
So it's geographic, right? So the census has a definition of what a city is or what a town is.
Yes.
And you go and count the number of people within that geography.
So what is the definition of a town or a city?
Based on population density.
Density of how much?
I'm not sure the exact number, but I'm presuming.
So there's a density, what else? Density, there's agricultural occupation. There's one other criteria, so 2 out of 3.
Corporates, government, from the government contracts, it is governed as its own.
There is size. If a little village, I'm not going to be urban even if nobody does any agricultural labor. So fundamentally, and as far as density is concerned, actually, if you think like the British did and count like they did in square miles, instead of square kilometers is an easy number to remember. It's 1,000. Right? But once you convert that into square kilometers, it becomes 400 per square kilometer, which is neither here nor there, right? So you have to fix in your memory. But broadly speaking, we didn't come about this one fine day. This thing evolved over time. If you look at how you essentially talked about it in 1881, which is before even I was born, you have, it says, a collection of numerous dwellings near each other with a limited area, which means dense, having shops which provide a continual open market, which means guys doing some kind of non-agricultural activity. So the elements of that story are there. All the way down till what I call the current threefold definition, which is not here, which is 5,000 people, 75% of working men in non-agricultural occupations, and a density of 400 per square kilometer. So 3 criteria to define urban. Right? Perfectly sounds reasonable. So now see what happens with that reasonable criteria. The first thing is it's reasonable, but no other country uses it. And so we are really hard to be urban in India. You have to jump through 3 hoops before you can be classified as urban. So India's definition of urban, as I said, is unique in terms of the intersection of 3 criteria. So that's one of the issues that we need to take into mind. If you look at a place like China, for instance, it goes on density and it goes on administrative presence, which basically means I call it urban, therefore it's urban. So, what does it mean? This means, broadly speaking, if I break up this 600,000 plus villages in this country into 3 little, how many of you have seen this stuff? What is it called? What? Somebody's teaching a lot of stuff. So it says, in some sense, this is all the guys who satisfy the density criteria. This is all the guys who satisfy the agricultural workforce criteria. And these are all the guys who live in large settlements. What you find actually, and these are all the villages. These are all the towns taken out, which already have 200, this is 2001, which already has 286 million people. We have just got the numbers for 2011, and one of these days we'll see a similar picture for 2011. But what it means is, remember this is all towns, right? What it means is, in 2001, the way the census counts, and I'm happy to talk about how the census counts, I think it's a perfectly reasonable way. But it's useful for you to remember that this is how definitions get put forward. 28 million people satisfied all the 3 criteria that we talked about, and yet were not classified as urban. Right? If you want to know the reason why, you'll have to wait until I finish the talk. So that's one part of the story. So we already have more than urban people than we are actually counting. The second is, I said, the way we count urban is actually a very strict way of doing so. It's like having a really strict teacher grade your paper versus a more lenient teacher grade your paper, right? So, if you graded it differently, how many people would actually be urban? So I'm going to give you about 2 other kinds of numbers. The first is a number by someone called Uchida and someone called Nelson, who wrote a paper in 2008, which was a background paper for the World Development Report of the World Bank. And they basically asked themselves, what does it mean to be urban? And they roughly went the way you guys were talking, which is how many people enjoy the facilities of an urban area, which means how many of them live within a short distance and a short distance for them was about an hour, of a reasonably large town. And a reasonably large town for them was 50,000. So how many people live within an hour of a town of 50,000? The answer in India in 2001 was 52%. Right? As opposed to the urbanization rate in 2001, which was less than 30%. More interestingly, China, which is supposed to be much more urbanized than India, in 2001, that number of people living within an hour of a town of 50,000 people was 36%. So by this guy's measurement, India was way more urbanized than China. Right? Let's look at another way of looking at it. You basically said people need to live close in large built-up areas. So the Europeans used this, what we call a density measurement. How many people live in built-up areas, and the built-up area doesn't need to be too far from each other. So for example, right here, all of you are fairly close together, so you'll form part of the same group. But there, if I have people with more than 2 chairs in between, they form different groups. So if I now sort of group all the people here with people who have more than 2 chairs between each other and people who have less than 2 chairs between each other, and put them all into all the guys who are less than 2 chairs between each other all form into one group. And the ones who have more than 2 chairs all form a different group. How many cities do you think we'll have here? I can see one city over here. I can see maybe another one over there. A third one. The rest is, I think I'm down to about 5 cities at most in this entire group. Right? So take that same idea and do some really hard work. What do? You go out, look at satellite images, you look down at them, and then you find out where is the built-up area, then you measure where the next built-up area is, then you calculate the distance between the built-up areas, and then you find out, give yourself a maximum distance between them, in this case 200 meters. Anything that's one built-up area to another built-up area, less than 200 meters, 1 chair distance, same city. More than 200 meters, 2 chairs, different city. If you do that, you find that in 2001, 37.1% of Indian people lived in dense agglomerations of more than 10,000 people, counted in that fashion. The official number for number of people living in more than 10,000 was 26%. Why? Because remember, going back to our definitions, they had to jump through 3 hoops. This is just a density hoop and a size hoop. The agricultural occupation hoop is not there. Right? So what do? You find that if you do this, and there's a gentleman called Eric Denis, who with his colleagues is actually doing this for the whole world as part of something called the eGeopolis project. He's trying to map every human settlement above 10,000 people. So this is just the one they've done for India, they've done so for Africa, for China, for Europe, whatever. And this is the difference between the 2 pictures. This is the official level of urbanization. This is the level that will happen if I choose this other definition. The reason I'm saying all this is largely because part of your education is to appreciate the fact that reasoning comes from assumptions. And what you assume to be urban is based on definitions. And those definitions should be open to challenge. And you should be able to understand what the implication of those definitions is or are. Right? So, change the definitions and change the assumptions, you'll get different answers. This was what happens to Bihar. All that red stuff that you see is settlements which are large enough to classify as urban under Geopolis, but who do not meet the 75% male workforce criteria. So that is what gives you the higher numbers in the Geopolis story as opposed to the others. Similarly, you have issues about commuting. People live in rural areas, work in urban. It's about 10 million. While all this is happening, remember all the numbers I've been showing you is essentially based on 2001. So we have, in 2001, there was about 50,000 kilometers of metal rural roads. Over the last few years, in this decade, we have built 300,000 kilometers of metal rural roads under something called the Prime Minister's Gram Sadak Yojana, PMGSY, the Prime Minister's Rural Roads Program. Right? What do you think this would have done? If I go back to the two definitions that I talked about, how does this change the two definitions? How do you think the numbers would change across those two definitions? So we go back to the Uchida-Nelson definition. How would this change the Uchida-Nelson definition? If I say that the amount of rural roads has gone up from 50,000 to 300,000.
Connectivity, more people would be living within 1 hour.
More people would be living within 1 hour. Right? So the Uchida-Nelson could actually jump enormously. And I'll tell you another reason why it might jump enormously. What about the other definition? How would that change? Can someone give me a story why that number might actually go down rather than up? The 200-meter story, yes, but I mean, why would it? I'm asking for a story why the number would actually go down.
Because data connectivity, you rather stay dispersed, right? You needn't agglomerate too much, you needn't stay too close to where you were. That way it happens.
Decrease in
That way it happens. Because if your time to
agricultural activities will grow and the shift will increase.
I'm asking for a story the other way around. That's a good story the other way around. All of those things will happen. That's quite true. Yes, you had it.
People like start staying away from cities because they're living away.
Why?
And the roads are constructed, they are easy land practice now. When they go away from cities, the density decreases.
Why would you think people would like to go away from cities? Just hold that thought. I'd like to come back to it in a second. Yes. If connectivity is better, people would migrate less. That is, let me take that up first and then I'll come back to you because I think yours is an interesting question to put together. In Europe, someone called Avner Greif and Guido Tabellini. And Avner has done some very interesting work on 16th century merchants in the Middle East, but we'll talk about that some other time. They essentially went out and found out that migration was more in some parts in Europe and less in others. And they did some fancy number crunching and they came to the conclusion that urbanization was slower, but family traditions were stronger. So people chose to stay on in villages. So in your case, if I could move and commute to the city, I'd rather stay on my village with my family rather than having to move to the city. And therefore, the commuting story that comes up here might actually become much stronger than actual movement, which will allow you to be part of the urban, be counted as urban in some sense. But you, so can you explain to me why you would want to not live in the city?
There were different reasons depending on the person's interest, but some of the main ones were like standard living. Where are we living away depending on the country you're in and the area you're living in.
So in India, how is the standard of living better if you're living away from the city?
Currently it's not as great as you would expect to be in cities. You don't have connections to like electricity, water connections in India basically.
So in India, do you think people would live away from the city?
Well, if they would start living away, they get proper facilities available. Our society is there which have all functions.
Okay, so it's, maybe I might try and pull that up later. I don't think I have this on this thing, but broadly speaking, in India, that in the US, what the process of what we call suburbanization started, and that was largely driven by three kinds of factors. One was race, second was crime, and third was the quality of urban schools. And people went out and established their own school districts and moved there. And now that process is churning back again. In India, because a lot of the people who can exercise that option and send their children to private schools, that doesn't seem to be a good reason to move. And our cities, at least of the official numbers, and I know perceptions can be very different, are often have much less crime than what you saw in American cities at that point in time. So what is the takeaway from all this discussion that we've been having? One is that urban may be much more important than what appears in the census of 31 million. Right? The second is, even where farm activity dominates, people are living together. Like Bihar, people are living together in large settlements. And then there are some areas which are not classified as urban, but which are urban by the census definition. And that's largely because of the way the census has to administer the activity, the Registrar General has to administer the census, the bureaucratic stuff that happens in doing that. Now, take a step back and see what kind of urban shape that we have got into. These are the cities that are familiar to you. Pune is actually very special. It is the only city above 5 million people in the entire country. It is not a state capital. Right? So, and these 5 million plus cities, as you can see, are distributed neatly across in a ring around the country. The pattern that emerges, we now have what, 50 million plus cities. If I throw in the 50 million plus, all this nice little ring I've put together will go away. So the way you present data can actually make you remember certain images. Or, is there any reason why I don't have 4 million cities in there? Or 4.5 million cities in there. If I start throwing those in, or 3 million cities in there, what is special about 5? Nothing really. The fact that 5 million cities form this nice pattern, to me doesn't really say very much. But you might end up seeing lots of literature showing up how the pattern of urbanization in India is this nice circular stuff which has gridded by very, very large cities on the periphery and on the coast, things like that. The interesting thing, however, that is happening is the cities themselves, Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, the core cities are not growing very good. This is the growth of the core district. This is the growth of the adjoining district. And in most cases, you'll find that the outside of the city is growing much faster than the core. So this is just detail. Delhi itself grew at about 2.5%, which if you listen to the Chief Minister of Delhi, you will not believe. She is still traumatized by the hordes of migrants that have come into Delhi over the last few generations, and therefore continues to worry about more and more migrants. But fundamentally, the numbers are that Delhi used to grow really rapidly at about 5% over the last year, almost from 1960 to 2000. But in the last 10 years, that number has dropped very sharply. But if you look at the periphery of Delhi, you have Gurgaon, you have Ghaziabad, you have Noida, those are really growing rapidly. Right? Similarly, Mumbai, all of Mumbai is almost not growing at all. But if you look at Thane and Raigad, they are going big. Right? So that's part of the story that you can put together. Now, why exactly are we talking through that? We'll talk. The second issue is, yes, more and more people are living in larger and larger cities. So today, 70% of Indians who are urban live in cities of more than 100,000 people. But these are not the same cities. So if you take a look at how many people live in, if you take the same million plus cities that were there in 2001, the number of people living in them has actually gone down as a share of the population. It's only because new million plus cities have joined the club that the share of million plus cities has gone up. Why is this important? It's important because it means that people are not coming to the same old cities, but people are coming to many cities around the country. And every 10 years when you count, but this is a continuous process, new cities are growing up and attracting people across the country. Right? The Indian pattern of urbanization is not limited and restricted to a few places, but actually relatively well spread out across the countryside. If you look at what cities today, which are more than 1 million plus today, and you see where were these cities 50 years ago, that picture becomes a lot clearer. So a lot of large cities today, which are 500,000, 100,000, had relatively small beginnings. In fact, there are about 50 cities today which have enjoyed a growth of about 5% a year consistently over the last 50 years, which is about the rate that Bangalore is growing today, and the rate that Delhi used to grow. And these 50 cities, some of them you'll know, so you have Nashik, Bhiwadi and Aurangabad in your neighborhood, Surat and Vapi across your border, Rudrapur. How many people have heard about Rudrapur? Yes, what have you heard about Rudrapur? Come again. You are from Rudrapur. Tell me about Rudrapur. It is one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Do you feel it? Have you seen it change dramatically over your... How long have you spent in Rudrapur? That's, even for you, that's a relatively long time in the life of the city. So, how has it changed? What was it like when you started going to school, and what is it like now? You want the microphone? Thank you. Go ahead. So give me a sense, how many shops were there, how many cinema halls, what did you do when you were in, there you are.
So now you have big companies over there like Britannia, Dabur, and you have Sipful, that is industrial area. The rates of land has gone up. Like, can I quote example?
When did this happen?
Very in recent times, like last 5 years.
Before that, what was it like?
So Sir, if the rate of land earlier was say 50 lakhs per acre, now it's 3 crores per acre. So you can see
Six
the
times.
data.
And that's actually a pretty good measure of what's happening to a city, what's happening to prices of land. But give me a sense apart from the price of land. Give me a sense about restaurants, give me a sense about cinema halls, how many schools, what do you guys want, what kind of video models do you have.
So
How many cinema halls in Rudrapur 15 years ago? Did you watch movies 15 years ago? Yes, wonderful. I'm never sure, yes.
So, like you have malls coming now, you have medicine, you have...
What was it? Tell me your 15 years ago, what did you have? Did you have a mall?
No.
Did you have a movie hall?
Yeah.
Okay. That's more than the places I know. Okay. How many movie halls? 2 movie halls. Okay. What is the screen? Hindi movies, English movies? Hindi movies. Do they now screen Hindi movies or English movies or both? Okay. So, and do people go to watch English movies?
Yes.
Right. So, as far as in your lifetime, that's a relatively short period of time in the history of a city. And why does this happen? Part of it happens because of the creation of a new state. Part of it happens because, what do you think of so many companies there now? You said Sinful was there, Britannia was there.
So because of, I guess, taxes are paid by the government.
The tax benefits that are available to certain areas of the country, Rudrapur happens to be one of them. Right? So in this case, as it happens, it's driven by government policy. But tax limits are available across, thank you so much. Tax limits are available across a variety of other locations. Why pick Rudrapur? That's one of the questions that somebody who is working on cities would have to answer, right? Look at another place called Miralguda. What is Miralguda? Has anyone heard about Miralguda? Andhra Pradesh? Yes. Don't tell me you are from there now. You are? This is amazing. Go right ahead. The microphone's coming to you.
I'm from Andhra, sir, but not from Miryal.
Okay.
I've heard about it.
So you've heard about it. You know anything
Not
about
much.
it?
I know it's in Andhra, that's all.
That's all.
It's around Hyderabad, I know that.
That if somebody that's reading carefully would know that.
It's around Hyderabad, I know that. It's in Telangana that I know.
Okay. You know what it, where are you from now?
I'm from Visakhapatnam.
You're from the coast. Okay. The possible new capital of the possible new state.
I know.
Right? Would you rather it become one or not?
No. I really wouldn't want it to become one.
Why?
Why? Because it will just complicate the city. It's a very beautiful city. And no political complications in that city. So far.
So, growth has its own ups and downs, its curses and its benefits and its cons. And you'd rather that Visakhapatnam stay the way that you remember it.
Yes.
A lot of people in Bangalore would say that. I have no idea what happened to Visakhapatnam last night, but I think I can be safely sure it will not remain as remembered. Whether it becomes the capital of Simandra or not, I do not think, or even if Simandra is formed or not, I don't think Visakhapatnam 25 years down the line will remain the way that you remember it when it was growing up. So what do we know about these things? Frankly, we know very little. And one of the gaps in urban research today is that it's been eminently focused on these big, large places and much less focused on these other places where a lot of things are happening. Right? So that's the... Now when I say a lot of things are happening, how do I know that? So there's something called the National Sample Survey, which actually goes out and asks people what do they do. And fortunately, you can break up their stuff into million-plus cities and other cities. And when you look at this, gives you a share of economic activity or employment in different types of economic activity in the million-plus cities as a share of total urban employment. And as you can see, in very few of them is it really more than 50%. So a lot of employment across very many economic activities happen in cities which are much less than 1 million people. And if you look, this gives you a sense of what is the structure of that employment. From here you see modern services, which is all your IT and stuff. That's about 1/7 of total employment in the big cities, and about half that in the smaller cities. But it's there. Okay? So if you look at these numbers and you say, is there very much difference between these two numbers? The difference between these two numbers is the difference between the type of jobs that are there in the smaller cities and the type of jobs that are there in the bigger cities. Now most of you will end up in these modern services sectors, and consequently for you, million-plus cities matter more. But there's a lot of people in this country who are going to be ending up in other activities, and consequently for them, it's the other cities matter just as much. So we then come to the last part of this particular description, which is a whole bunch of settlements which the census says is urban, but which state governments refuse to call out. Right? So they are what is called census towns. How many of you know what a census town is?